Who owns the forest? Forest ownership in the United States. Forest land ownership can be classified into two basic categories: public ownership and private ownership. Here in the United States, about 37% of our forest is owned by public entities such as the federal government, state governments, and local governments. Private ownership is broken down into a bit more categories, and it's about 63% of our forest ownership is classified as private ownership. Private owners include family forest owners, corporate owners such as companies like Weyerhaeuser, which you may recognize, Jordan Lumber Company, and others, as well as what is referred to as other ownerships, such as maybe non-government organizations, hunt clubs, private companies that are less well known, unincorporated partnerships, and groups like that. In the United States, forest land is set a pattern across the United States as far as ownership goes. If you look and divide the country in half, through Iowa down through the western part of Texas and everything, you kind of see that white space in this image. Everything to the east of that, almost really, if you look at almost everything east of the Mississippi, is dominated by private land ownership, and everything to the western part is dominated by federal ownership. Why is this ownership pattern such as in the United States? Really what we've seen is as we began to settle the United States and moved west, land was given away to people to move west to settle. And so a lot of our land was, forest land was converted to agricultural land. So we saw huge shifts in losses in forest land as we settled west. But we also, a lot of it was given away as things such as the Homestead Act, in which landowners would give land to homestead on. Well, as we moved across the United States and into the western part of the United States, policies began to change. There was concerns about the conservation of our forest land. Presidents such as Teddy Roosevelt, individuals like John Muir, those type of people were conservationists, and they were looking for ways to conserve our land. So as we moved into the western United States, what we saw were large acreages of land set aside for the federal government. That's what's created our U.S. forest system and our U.S. forest reserves. They were concerned about timber loss, so large areas of timberland were set aside as reserves, but also large areas were set aside such as in national parks. And most of that is dominated in the western part of the United States. So if you look at federal ownership, which is 28% of all forest land in the United States, 70% of that takes place in the western United States, and roughly about 30% in the eastern United States. And as I indicated a second ago, this was driven by the conservation movement and has really shaped our ownership patterns across the United States. State ownership only accounts for 7%. Most of that is in the eastern U.S. and lake states. It's dominated in states like New York, Minnesota, and Michigan. Those are states that have a significant amount of state-owned land, and these lands were set aside to protect cultural and natural resources, providing economic, environmental, and social benefits at the state level. Local ownership, these are your local governments such as your counties and municipalities. Only about 2% of our forest land in the United States is under local ownership. And much of this has been set aside at the local level to focus on providing environmental and social benefits. Family ownership, 43% of our American forest land is owned under what we call family ownership. These are individuals, maybe yourself or your family, that owns forest land. We're not really in the business of timber production and things like that with this family ownership. Not that we're not interested in things like harvesting timber and making money off our land, but we're not the same as a corporate business. And so it really dominates the eastern United States, this forest ownership pattern. It was shaped by how our country was settled. So, for example, by the 1880s, Congress passed thousands of statutes to dispose of the public domain, such as the Homestead Act, other types of policies to pass this land on to private individuals. And this has really created us some unique management challenges due to the diversity in family ownership. It's important to note that family ownership includes individuals, families, trusts, estates, and family partnerships. Corporate ownership, that dominates, well, not dominates, well, it does dominate in the U.S. South, but it's only 16% of America's forest land. And a large turnover took place in the early 2000s in this ownership. Many of our corporate owners divested of their forest land. Companies such as Plum Creek, Georgia Pacific, other companies like that have passed their land on and sold it off to such organizations as timber investment management organizations or real estate investment trusts. These are entities that invest in forest land for their members in order to make a profit. And we're not sure how this will impact forest management going forward, since the sole purpose is more of a profit-driven motive. They may be more likely to divest themselves of this land after they've gotten the profit that they need for their members. Other private ownerships, these are conservation on natural resource organizations, unincorporated partnerships and associations in the Native American tribal lands. These are about 4% of American forest land is owned, and these really have provided these owners recreational opportunities, conservation opportunities, some economic opportunities. And really, from a tribal land standpoint, they're in very select areas such as New Mexico, Kentucky, places like that, up through the Dakotas. These are more tribal lands. As you can see, for several states, there's very few private ownerships, less than 5–10%. Let's delve a little bit further into forest ownership of the southern forest, and the reason we're choosing the southern forest, it really has become the breadbasket of forestry here in the United States. And production forestry, the large number of family forest owners are really unique in this situation of forestry and the idea of forest management. In the southern U.S., if we look at forest ownership, about 13% of the forests in the South are publicly owned. That leaves about 80% in private ownership. And approximately a third of that private ownership is corporate ownership, with the remainder held by families and individuals. But if you look at forest ownership in the southern U.S., family ownership accounts for about 58% of the forest land here in the U.S. South. From a corporate ownership standpoint, changes in corporate ownership has been the most significant change in forest land ownership in the recent history of forest ownership here in the United States. Forest product industry had divested itself of forest land and has become less worried about timber supply and the need to adjust to the new economy. As you can see, from 1998 to 2008, there has been some significant change in industry ownership. And who was acquiring that land? That was our timber investment management organizations and our real estate investment trust, otherwise known as TIMO and REITs. If you look at size of forest holdings, the largest ownership group, both in numbers of owners and acres, is the family forest owners. And if you look only at the number of owners, our family forest ownership group, really it's dominated by the number of owners that own 1 to 9 acres. So really any real small acres is across the landscape, as you can imagine, creates all kinds of management concerns and issues, and makes it an interesting situation in working with landowners because of the diversity of landowners. But if you look at it from an area standpoint, many of our forest landowners own a lot of forest land, large quantities of land. You know, if you look at everything from about 100 acres and up, that's a lot of large land holdings by a few owners. So it's interesting from a management standpoint, working with a few landowners, you can have significant impact on the management of land, but it's important to realize that all owners and their land are important to the forest industry, timber supply, as we move forward.